Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we least expect them. In a world where we're constantly told to follow rules, stay in line, and respect boundaries, what happens when someone breaks the invisible barrier between duty and humanity? What happens when a single gesture transforms not just two lives, but touches the hearts of millions around the world? This is the story of a moment that lasted just 3 seconds, but created ripples that would spread across continents. A story about a young tourist who didn't know the rules, a royal guard who chose compassion over protocol, and how one spontaneous high five became a symbol of hope that reminded us all of our shared humanity. In the heart of London, where tradition meets modern life every single day, where ancient ceremonies play out against the backdrop of bustling city streets, something extraordinary was about to happen. Something that would challenge everything we think we know about duty, rules, and the power of human connection. This is that story, a true story that proves sometimes the most beautiful moments come from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply be human. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Horse Guards Parade as tourists began their daily pilgrimage to witness one of London's most iconic traditions. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the usual sounds of the city seemed muted in this historic corner of Westminster, where centuries of royal tradition played out daily before the eyes of visitors from around the world. Among the gathering crowd stood Marcus Thompson, a 24-year-old teacher from a small town in Ohio. This was his first trip to London, a graduation gift to himself after completing his master's degree in education. Marcus had spent months saving every penny, working extra shifts at the local diner, tutoring students after school, and even selling his beloved guitar to make this dream trip possible. He carried with him a worn guidebook that his grandmother had given him, filled with handwritten notes and dog-eared pages marking all the places she had dreamed of visiting but never had the chance to see. Marcus was not like the typical tourists who flocked to London's royal sights. While others came with expensive cameras and designer luggage, he carried a simple backpack and an old smartphone with a cracked screen. But what he lacked in material possessions, he made up for with genuine curiosity and an infectious enthusiasm that seemed to light up every space he entered. He had a habit of striking up conversations with strangers, learning their stories, and finding connections in the most unlikely places. On this particular morning, Marcus had arrived early to secure a good viewing spot for the changing of the guard ceremony. He had read about this tradition in his guidebook, but nothing had prepared him for the actual experience. The precision, the pageantry, the weight of history that seemed to hang in the air, it all felt both surreal and deeply moving. Standing across from him, in perfect formation, was Lance Corporal James Mitchell of the Coldstream Guards. At 26, James was a seasoned member of the King's Guard, having served for 8 years in various capacities. His red tunic was immaculate, his bearskin hat perfectly positioned, and his expression maintained the stoic composure that had become synonymous with the British Royal Guard. To the casual observer, James appeared to be the very embodiment of military discipline and royal protocol. But beneath that composed exterior was a young man who had joined the military not out of family tradition or personal ambition, but out of necessity. James had grown up in a rough neighborhood in Manchester, where opportunities were scarce and trouble was always lurking around the corner. The military had been his escape route, his chance to build something meaningful from his life. He took pride in his service, in the history he was part of, and in the discipline that had transformed him from a troubled teenager into a respected soldier. However, being a member of the King's Guard was not just about military service. It was about becoming a living piece of history, a silent guardian of tradition who was expected to remain motionless and expressionless for hours at a time. James had learned to find a kind of meditation in this stillness, to observe the world around him while remaining completely detached from it. He had watched thousands of tourists pass by, seen their amazement, their attempts to get reactions, their selfies, and videos. He had become expert at remaining unmoved by it all. The rules were clear and non-negotiable. Members of the King's Guard were not to interact with the public under any circumstances. They were not to speak, smile, or acknowledge the tourists in any way. They were living statues, symbols of the crown's dignity and the military's unwavering dedication. Breaking these rules could result in serious disciplinary action, including dismissal from the prestigious position. James had never been tempted to break protocol. He understood the importance of maintaining the mystique, the sense of otherworldly discipline that made the King's Guard so fascinating to visitors from around the world. But on this particular morning, something was different. Perhaps it was the quality of the light, the way the autumn air seemed charged with possibility, or maybe it was simply that he was human, and humans are unpredictable creatures, even when dressed in the finest military regalia. As the morning progressed and the crowd thickened, Marcus found himself positioned almost directly in front of James. The young American was clearly captivated by the ceremony, but unlike many tourists who seemed more interested in getting the perfect selfie, Marcus appeared genuinely moved by what he was witnessing. James could see the wonder in the young man's eyes, the way he was trying to absorb every detail, every nuance of the ancient ritual unfolding before him. There was something about Marcus that caught James's attention. Maybe it was the way he respectfully maintained his distance while others pushed forward, or how he quietly observed without the constant chatter that characterized most tour groups. Marcus carried himself with a kind of humble appreciation that suggested this experience meant something deeper to him than just another tourist attraction to check off his list. The ceremony proceeded with its usual precision. The guards marched in perfect synchronization, their movements sharp and deliberate, each step echoing off the surrounding buildings. The tourists watched in fascination. Cameras clicked, and children pointed in wonder at the magnificent spectacle. For most of those present, this was entertainment, a glimpse into a world so different from their own that it seemed almost fictional. But for Marcus, watching from his position in the crowd, something deeper was happening. He found himself thinking about the young man standing so still beneath that imposing bearskin hat. What was his story? What had brought him to this place, to this moment? Did he ever get tired of standing so still? Did he ever want to just talk to someone, to break free from the rigid constraints of his role? These questions might have remained forever unanswered, existing only in the mind of a curious young tourist, if not for what happened next. As the formal ceremony concluded and the guards began to take their positions for the long hours of static duty that lay ahead, Marcus felt an unexpected impulse. It wasn't planned or premeditated. It was simply a moment of human connection calling out across the divide between civilian and soldier, between American tourist and British Guardian, between spontaneity and protocol. What Marcus didn't know was that James had been observing him too, noting his respectful behavior and genuine interest. In 8 years of service, James had developed an ability to read people quickly, to distinguish between those who saw the guards as curiosities to be mocked and those who understood they were witnessing something significant. Marcus clearly belonged to the latter category, and that recognition had created a tiny crack in James's professional armor. The crowd was beginning to disperse, some tourists moving on to their next destination, others settling in to watch the guards maintain their posts. The morning sun had climbed higher, and the shadows that had stretched across the courtyard were now shorter and sharper. It was in this moment of transition, as the formal ceremony gave way to the long, quiet hours of guard duty, that the impossible was about to become reality. Neither Marcus nor James could have predicted what was about to happen. Neither understood that they were about to become part of a story that would spread around the world, touching hearts and challenging perceptions about duty, humanity, and the power of simple human gestures to bridge any divide. They were just two young men from different countries and different worlds about to discover that sometimes the most meaningful connections happen in the most unexpected moments. The tourists had mostly moved on, leaving behind only a small group of dedicated observers who seemed content to watch the guards maintain their silent vigil. Marcus found himself among this smaller crowd, reluctant to leave despite having already witnessed the ceremony he had come to see. There was something about this place, about the weight of history and tradition, that made him want to linger and absorb every detail. He pulled out his phone to take a few photos, not for social media or to show off to friends back home, but simply to preserve this moment for himself. Through the cracked screen, he watched James standing at attention, every line of his uniform perfect, every inch of his posture speaking to years of discipline and training. Marcus lowered his phone and found himself making eye contact with the guard, though James's expression remained completely neutral, giving no indication that he was even aware of the young American's presence. But James was aware, more than aware. In the years he had spent as a member of the King's Guard, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to observe his surroundings while maintaining his stoic pose. He could track the movement of every tourist, assess potential threats, and monitor the behavior of the crowd, all while appearing completely detached from the world around him. What struck him about Marcus was the young man's obvious respect for what he was witnessing. While other tourists had pushed boundaries, trying to get guards to react or break character, Marcus maintained a respectful distance. He wasn't trying to make a spectacle or create content for social media. He seemed genuinely moved by the ceremony, as if he understood that he was witnessing something sacred and ancient. This recognition created an unexpected warmth in James's chest, a feeling that caught him off guard. In his years of service, he had learned to compartmentalize his emotions, to separate his human feelings from his professional duties. But something about this moment, about this particular tourist, was making that separation more difficult than usual. Marcus stood there for several more minutes, seemingly lost in thought. He appeared to be studying not just the pageantry and tradition, but trying to understand the human being beneath the uniform. This level of empathy and curiosity was rare among the tourists James encountered daily, most of whom saw the guards as living statues rather than real people with their own stories and experiences. Finally, Marcus seemed to make a decision. He approached slowly and respectfully, stopping at what he judged to be an appropriate distance. He didn't try to get close enough to pose for a selfie or to test the guard's resolve. Instead, he simply stood there, as if paying his respects to everything that James and his position represented. Then, in a moment that surprised even himself, Marcus raised his hand in a gesture that was unmistakably friendly and deeply human. It wasn't a wave or an attempt to distract the guard. It was simply an offering, a high five extended across the divide between tourist and guardian, between American informality and British tradition. The gesture hung in the air for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Marcus stood there with his hand extended, not demanding a response, but simply offering connection. His face showed no expectation of reciprocation, no challenge to authority. It was simply one human being reaching out to another, acknowledging their shared humanity despite the vast differences in their circumstances. James felt his heart rate increase slightly, though his expression remained perfectly neutral. This was exactly the kind of situation he had been trained to handle without any acknowledgement whatsoever. The proper response was to continue staring straight ahead, to pretend the gesture had never happened, to maintain the mystique and dignity of his position. 8 years of training had prepared him for this exact scenario. But something unexpected happened in that moment. Instead of thinking about regulations and protocol, James found himself thinking about the young man standing before him. He thought about the obvious effort Marcus had made to come here, about the worn guidebook he had seen the tourist consulting earlier, about the genuine respect and wonder in his eyes during the ceremony. He thought about the fact that this young American had traveled thousands of miles to witness something that James participated in every day, and how different their perspectives on this moment must be. More than that, James found himself remembering why he had joined the military in the first place. It hadn't been about following rules or maintaining traditions. It had been about service, about being part of something larger than himself, about protecting and serving the people. And wasn't this young tourist, in his own way, exactly the kind of person James had sworn to serve? The thoughts raced through his mind in the space of heartbeats, but they felt like they lasted hours. James was acutely aware of the other tourists watching, of the security cameras that recorded everything, of the career-ending consequences that could result from breaking protocol. But he was also aware of something else, a deep certainty that this moment was asking something of him that went beyond military regulations. In his peripheral vision, James could see that other tourists had noticed Marcus's gesture and were watching to see what would happen. Some had their phones out, ready to record whatever came next. The moment had taken on a weight that neither Marcus nor James had anticipated, and now they were both part of something larger than either of them had intended. Marcus continued to stand there, his hands still extended, but his expression showed that he was beginning to understand the position he had put the guard in. There was no demand in his eyes, no challenge or expectation. If anything, he looked slightly apologetic, as if he was beginning to realize that a spontaneous gesture might have created an uncomfortable situation. This recognition only strengthened the unexpected warmth James was feeling. Here was someone who was not only respectful enough to offer genuine human connection, but also considerate enough to understand the complexity of the situation he had created. Marcus wasn't trying to make the guard break rules or create a viral moment. He was simply being human, offering friendship and connection, and then allowing space for whatever response felt appropriate. It was in this moment of mutual understanding and respect that James made a decision that would change both of their lives. It wasn't a decision made lightly or impulsively. It was the result of 8 years of service, of understanding what it meant to serve something larger than himself, and of recognizing authentic human goodness when he encountered it. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, James began to lift his right hand. The movement was subtle enough that casual observers might have missed it entirely, but Marcus, who was watching intently, saw it immediately. James's hand rose with the same precision and control that characterized all of his movements as a guard, but this time it was guided by something entirely different from military protocol. When their palms met in a perfect high five, the sound echoed across the courtyard like a small thunderclap. It was a sound that seemed to contain within it all the accumulated tension of the moment, all the bridging of worlds that had just taken place, all the humanity that had triumphed over protocol. The reaction from the gathered tourists was immediate and electric. Gasps of amazement, excited chatter, and the distinctive sound of phone cameras capturing the moment filled the air. But neither Marcus nor James was paying attention to any of that. For those few seconds, their worlds had contracted to just the two of them and the connection they had just shared. Marcus's face broke into a smile that seemed to light up the entire courtyard. It wasn't a smile of triumph or accomplishment, but one of pure joy and gratitude. He had offered something genuine and human, and it had been received in the same spirit. The fact that it had required such courage on the guard's part only made the gesture more meaningful. James, for his part, felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the autumn sunshine. In 8 years of service, he had never experienced anything quite like this moment. He had participated in countless ceremonies, met dignitaries and officials, served with distinction in various capacities. But this simple exchange with a young American tourist felt like the most meaningful thing he had done in uniform. As quickly as it had happened, the moment was over. James returned his hand to his side and resumed his position, his expression returning to the neutral mask that was expected of him. But something had fundamentally changed. The connection that had been made couldn't be unmade, and both men knew that they had just been part of something special. The immediate aftermath of the high five was a blur of excited voices and clicking phones. Marcus stepped back, still smiling broadly, but also clearly aware that he needed to give James space to return to his official duties. The young American's respect for the guard's position was evident in how quickly he moved away from the immediate area, though the joy on his face remained unmistakable. Other tourists who had witnessed the moment began approaching Marcus, eager to understand what had just happened. A middle-aged woman from Australia was the first to reach him, her eyes bright with excitement. "Did you plan that?" she asked breathlessly. "How did you know he would respond?" Marcus shook his head, still somewhat dazed by what had just occurred. "I didn't plan anything," he said honestly. "I just felt like he seemed like a really good person underneath all that formal stuff, and I wanted to let him know that someone appreciated what he was doing." He paused, looking back toward James, who had resumed his perfect stillness. "I never expected him to actually respond. That was incredible of him." A young British man who had been filming the ceremony overheard the conversation and introduced himself as Oliver, a local university student studying history. "Do you understand what just happened?" Oliver asked Marcus with genuine amazement. "The King's Guard never breaks protocol. Never. In all the years I've been coming here, I've never seen anything like that. You just witnessed something extraordinary." Marcus was beginning to understand the significance of what had occurred, but he was more focused on the human aspect than the protocol-breaking element. "He didn't have to do that," Marcus said quietly. "He could have just ignored me, and that would have been completely appropriate. The fact that he chose to respond says something really beautiful about who he is as a person." Word of the incident was already beginning to spread through the tourist crowd. People who hadn't witnessed it firsthand were being told about it by those who had, and each retelling seemed to add to the sense of wonder and amazement. Several tourists approached the area where James was standing, hoping to recreate the moment, but the guard maintained his professional composure, giving no indication that anything unusual had occurred. Meanwhile, James was dealing with his own internal reaction to what had just happened. While his exterior remained perfectly composed, his mind was racing. He was acutely aware that his actions had been witnessed by dozens of people, some of whom had certainly captured the moment on their phones. He knew that this could have serious professional consequences, and yet he found that he couldn't bring himself to regret what he had done. The sincerity and respect that Marcus had shown had touched something deep within James. In his years of service, he had encountered countless tourists who saw the guards as curiosities or challenges to their creativity in getting reactions. But Marcus had approached the situation with genuine humanity and respect, and that had called forth a response that transcended military protocol. As the morning progressed, James could see people in the crowd pointing in his direction and talking excitedly. He caught fragments of conversations about what they had witnessed, and he could tell that the story was growing with each retelling. Some observers seemed to understand the significance of what had happened, while others appeared to view it simply as an amusing incident. One of the tourists who had captured the moment on video was Sarah Chun, a travel blogger from Canada who had been documenting her European adventure for a modest but engaged online following. As she reviewed the footage on her phone, she realized she had captured something truly special. The video showed not just the high five itself, but the moments leading up to it. Marcus's respectful approach, his genuine gesture, and the careful consideration that had preceded James's response. Sarah found herself deeply moved by what she had witnessed. This wasn't just a funny moment or a tourist getting a guard of break character. It was a genuine human connection that had transcended cultural differences, professional obligations, and social expectations. She felt compelled to share it, not for views or engagement, but because she believed the world needed to see this kind of authentic human goodness. That evening, Sarah uploaded the video to her social media accounts with a thoughtful caption that attempted to capture the emotional weight of what had occurred. She wrote about the respect Marcus had shown, the courage James had demonstrated, and the beautiful reminder that beneath uniforms and protocols, we are all human beings capable of connection and compassion. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the video had been shared hundreds of times. By the next morning, it had reached the thousands. People from around the world were commenting on the post, sharing their own stories of unexpected human connections, and expressing their amazement at the guard's willingness to break protocol for such a genuine moment. Marcus, meanwhile, had continued his London adventure, unaware of the digital storm brewing around his spontaneous gesture. He had spent the afternoon visiting museums and exploring neighborhoods, his mind still returning periodically to the incredible moment he had shared with the King's Guard. He had taken a few photos of other landmarks, but none of them seemed to capture his attention the way that brief connection had. That evening, as Marcus sat in his modest hotel room, he received a message from his sister back in Ohio. She had seen a video on social media that looked like it might be him and wanted to know if he was becoming internet famous in London. Confused, Marcus asked her to send him the link, and when he saw Sarah's video, he was stunned. The footage was clear and well captured, showing the entire sequence of events from his approach to the high five to his respectful retreat. But what struck Marcus most powerfully was seeing the moment from an outside perspective. He could see the significance that others were attributing to it, but he could also see something else, the genuine humanity that had passed between him and James in those few seconds. Reading through the comments, Marcus was amazed by the response from people around the world. There were messages of appreciation for both his respectful approach and the guard's willingness to respond. People were sharing stories of their own encounters with the King's Guard, discussing the balance between duty and humanity, and expressing hope that the guard wouldn't face consequences for his actions. This last concern had been growing in Marcus's mind as well. He was beginning to understand that James might have put his career at risk for their moment of connection, and that thought was deeply troubling to him. The last thing Marcus wanted was for his spontaneous gesture to cause problems for someone who had shown him such unexpected kindness. Back at his barracks, James was also becoming aware of the videos spread across social media. Word had reached his commanding officers, and he had been called in for a meeting the following morning to discuss the incident. James spent the night thinking about how he would explain his actions, how he would justify breaking protocol for what some might see as a trivial interaction with a tourist. But as James reflected on the moment, he found himself thinking not about rules and regulations, but about the core values that had led him to military service in the first place. Service, honor, and protecting the people he had sworn to serve. In that moment with Marcus, James had served something larger than protocol. He had served the fundamental human need for connection and recognition. The video continued to spread throughout the night, being shared across different platforms and reaching audiences far beyond Sarah's original following. News outlets began to take notice, and by morning, what had started as a simple moment between two strangers had become a global story about humanity, duty, and the power of genuine connection. Neither Marcus nor James could have predicted that their brief interaction would resonate with so many people around the world. They had simply acted authentically in a moment that called for human connection, and that authenticity had created ripples that were spreading far beyond anything they could have imagined. The story was no longer just about a tourist and a guard. It had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that beneath all the divisions and differences that seem to separate us, we are all human beings capable of recognizing and responding to genuine goodness in one another. And that message, in a world that often seems focused on conflict and division, was exactly what millions of people needed to hear. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the military administrative building as James Mitchell walked down the familiar corridors toward what could potentially be a career-defining meeting. His uniform was immaculate as always, his bearing confident despite the uncertainty that lay ahead. He had spent the night preparing for this moment, thinking through how he would explain his actions and why he had chosen to break centuries of protocol for a 3-second interaction with a stranger. Colonel Harrison, James's commanding officer, was a man who commanded respect through his fair leadership and deep understanding of both military tradition and human nature. He had served for over 30 years and had seen the evolution of the King's Guard from a purely ceremonial role to one that required balancing ancient traditions with modern realities. When he had first heard about the incident, his initial reaction had been concern for the implications, but as he had watched the video that was now circulating globally, he found himself experiencing something unexpected, admiration. James entered the office and stood at attention, waiting for permission to speak. Colonel Harrison gestured for him to sit, an informality that immediately suggested this would not be a typical disciplinary meeting. The colonel had printed out several pages of comments from a viral video and news articles that had begun appearing in major publications around the world. Lance Corporal Mitchell, Colonel Harrison began, his voice carrying its usual authority, but with an undertone of genuine curiosity. It seems you've managed to capture the attention of the entire world with a single gesture. I've been in the military for 3 decades, and I've never seen anything quite like this response to a breach of protocol. James took a deep breath before responding. Sir, I understand that my actions were contrary to regulations, and I accept full responsibility for them. I made a decision in the moment based on what I felt was right, even though I knew it violated established procedures. The colonel leaned back in his chair, studying the young soldier before him. Tell me about that decision, Mitchell. Help me understand what led you to risk your career for a high five with a tourist. James had anticipated this question and had spent considerable time thinking about his answer. Sir, in my 8 years of service, I've encountered thousands of tourists. Most of them see us as either entertainment or challenges to their creativity in getting reactions. But this young man was different. He approached the situation with genuine respect and humanity. He wasn't trying to make me break character or create a spectacle. He was simply offering human connection. The colonel nodded slowly, encouraging James to continue. When I saw his gesture, I realized that this wasn't about protocol or tradition. This was about recognizing authentic goodness and responding to it with the same authenticity. I thought about why I joined the military in the first place, to serve people like him, to protect and honor those who approach life with genuine respect and kindness. Colonel Harrison picked up one of the printed articles and read aloud. The guard's response demonstrates that beneath the centuries of tradition and military precision, the King's Guard remains committed to the fundamental human values that the monarchy represents. This moment reminds us that true honor lies not in rigid adherence to rules, but in recognizing and responding to genuine human goodness. James listened with surprise. He hadn't expected the media coverage to interpret his actions so thoughtfully. This article, the colonel continued, is from the Times. There are dozens more like it from publications around the world. Social media is flooded with positive responses from people who see your actions as a beautiful reminder of our shared humanity. The video has been viewed millions of times, and the overwhelming response is one of admiration and appreciation. The colonel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the courtyard where the incident had taken place. The palace has been monitoring the situation, and they've received hundreds of messages praising your actions. The Secretary of State for Defense has called to discuss the unprecedented positive attention this has brought to the King's Guard. James felt a mixture of relief and continued confusion. This was not the direction he had expected the conversation to take. However, Colonel Harrison continued, turning back to face James. We cannot ignore the fact that protocol was broken. The traditions and procedures that govern the King's Guard exist for important reasons, and we cannot simply overlook violations, regardless of their positive outcomes. James nodded, understanding that consequences were inevitable. I accept whatever disciplinary action is deemed appropriate, sir. The colonel smiled slightly, the first time James had seen such an expression during an official meeting. The disciplinary action, Mitchell, is that you're being promoted to corporal, effective immediately. Additionally, you're being assigned to a special liaison role that will involve representing the King's Guard at community events and public relations functions. James stared at his commanding officer in disbelief. Sir, I'm not sure I understand. What you did yesterday, Mitchell, was demonstrate exactly the kind of judgment and character we want representing the crown. You showed that our traditions are strong enough to accommodate genuine human connection when it's appropriate. You proved that the King's Guard can honor both protocol and humanity. Meanwhile, across London, Marcus was dealing with his own unexpected consequences. The hotel staff had recognized him from the viral video and were treating him like a celebrity. More importantly, he had received dozens of messages from friends, family, and complete strangers who had been touched by the moment he had shared with James. Among these messages was one that particularly moved him. It was from an elderly veteran who wrote, "Young man, what you did yesterday reminded me why I served. You showed respect for tradition while offering genuine human connection. That guard's response proved that our military serves not just duty, but the best of human nature. Thank you for reminding us all of what really matters." Marcus was also growing increasingly concerned about James and whether the guard had faced negative consequences for his actions. He had tried to research how he might contact the appropriate military authorities to explain his role in the incident, but had been unsuccessful in finding the right channels. His concern was alleviated when he received an unexpected phone call that afternoon. The voice on the other end was professional but warm. "Mr. Thompson, this is Lieutenant Williams from the King's Guard. I'm calling to invite you to a special ceremony tomorrow where you will have the opportunity to meet Lance Corporal Mitchell and several other members of the Guard in a more formal setting." Marcus was stunned. Is he in trouble? I never meant for anything I did to cause problems for him. Lieutenant Williams chuckled. Quite the opposite, Mr. Thompson. Lance Corporal Mitchell has been commended for his actions. The ceremony tomorrow is to recognize both of you for demonstrating the values that the King's Guard represents: honor, service, and the recognition of genuine human goodness. The ceremony took place the following afternoon in a formal reception room at Wellington Barracks. Marcus arrived dressed in the best clothes he had brought for his trip, feeling nervous but excited about the opportunity to see James again and hopefully express his gratitude properly. When James entered the room, now wearing the insignia of his new rank, Marcus immediately stood and extended his hand for a proper handshake. James accepted it with a genuine smile, and for a moment, they were just two young men sharing a moment of mutual respect and appreciation. "I was worried that I had gotten you into trouble," Marcus said earnestly. "The last thing I wanted was for my actions to cause problems for you." James shook his head. "Your actions reminded me why I serve. They helped me remember that our traditions are meant to serve something larger than themselves. They're meant to honor and protect the best of human nature." Colonel Harrison addressed the small gathering, which included several senior officers and representatives from various military and civilian organizations. "What we witnessed yesterday was not a violation of tradition, but a demonstration of what our traditions truly represent." Lance Corporal Mitchell's response to Mr. Thompson's gesture showed that the King's Guard serves not just protocol, but the fundamental values that make us human. The colonel continued, "Mr. Thompson's approach to our traditions showed the kind of respect and genuine appreciation that makes service meaningful. Together, they created a moment that has reminded millions of people around the world of our shared capacity for goodness and connection." As the ceremony concluded, Marcus and James exchanged contact information, beginning what would become a lasting friendship that transcended their different backgrounds and circumstances. They had discovered that genuine human connection can bridge any divide, even one as formal and traditional as that between a tourist and a member of the King's Guard. The story of their interaction continued to resonate around the world, serving as a reminder that in an age of division and conflict, simple gestures of respect and humanity can create profound connections that touch hearts and inspire hope across all boundaries. 6 months after the high five heard around the world, the story of Marcus and James had evolved into something neither could have anticipated. What began as a spontaneous moment of human connection had grown into a movement that was changing how people thought about tradition, service, and the power of authentic human interaction. Marcus had returned to Ohio, transformed by his experience. His small-town school district had invited him to speak about his London adventure, but what he shared went far beyond typical travel stories. He talked to his students about the importance of approaching others with respect and genuine curiosity, about how authentic gestures can bridge cultural and social divides, and about the courage it takes to be genuinely human in a world that often rewards conformity. His classroom had become a gathering place for discussions about empathy, cultural understanding, and the ways that individual actions can create ripples of positive change. Marcus had started what he called connection projects, encouraging his students to find ways to reach across differences in their own community, whether those differences were social, economic, cultural, or generational. One of his most successful projects involved pairing his students with elderly residents from a local nursing home. The initial goal had been simple letter writing, but it had evolved into regular visits, technology lessons taught by teenagers to seniors, and intergenerational storytelling sessions that enriched both age groups. Marcus often told his students that these connections reminded him of his experience with James, moments when people choose to see past surface differences and connect with the humanity in one another. The impact of Marcus's teaching approach had caught the attention of educational leaders beyond his small town. He had been invited to speak at conferences about innovative approaches to character education and global citizenship. Publishers had reached out about turning his experience into educational materials that could help other teachers inspire similar projects in their own communities. But for Marcus, the most meaningful outcome was the stream of letters and messages he continued to receive from people around the world who had been inspired by his story. Parents wrote to thank him for providing a model of respectful curiosity they could share with their children. Travelers wrote about how his example had encouraged them to approach new cultures with greater openness and respect. Young people wrote about finding the courage to reach out across social boundaries in their own communities. Meanwhile, James's life had changed just as dramatically. His promotion and new role as community liaison had opened doors he never could have imagined. He found himself speaking at schools, community centers, and international events about service, tradition, and the importance of balancing duty with humanity. His most rewarding assignment had been developing a new program that brought school groups to interact with the King's Guard in more meaningful ways. Instead of simply observing the changing of the guard ceremony, students now had opportunities to learn about the history and significance of the traditions, meet the guards as individuals, and discuss the values that military service represents. James discovered that he had a gift for connecting with young people. His own background, growing up in challenging circumstances, and finding direction through military service, resonated with many students who were struggling to find their own paths. He became a mentor and role model, showing that discipline and duty could coexist with compassion and human connection. The program James developed had become so successful that it was being implemented at other royal and military sites throughout the United Kingdom. International delegations had visited to study the model, and similar programs were being developed in other countries. The idea that traditional institutions could maintain their dignity and historical significance while also embracing genuine human connection was spreading far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace. James had also been invited to participate in veteran support programs and mental health initiatives within military. His willingness to show vulnerability and authentic emotion, demonstrated in that moment with Marcus, had made him an advocate for the importance of emotional intelligence and human connection within military culture. The friendship between Marcus and James had deepened over the months through regular video calls, messages, and visits. James had traveled to Ohio during his leave time, where he experienced American hospitality and small-town life, while Marcus had returned to London twice more, each time learning more about British culture and history from his friend who had become his personal guide. Their friendship had become a symbol of international connection and understanding. They had been interviewed together by major news outlets about the lasting impact of their encounter, and their story had been included in diplomatic discussions about cultural exchange and people-to-people connections that strengthen international relationships. More importantly, Their friendship had inspired countless others to seek out similar connections across cultural and geographical boundaries. Social media groups had formed around the concept of connection across difference, with people sharing stories of their own attempts to bridge divides in their communities and around the world. The original video of their high five had been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms. But more significant were the thousands of response videos people had created showing their own moments of unexpected connection. Teachers connecting with difficult students, neighbors reaching across cultural divides, strangers helping one another in times of need, all inspired by the simple example of two young men who chose humanity over protocol. Academic researchers have begun studying the phenomenon, examining how genuine human moments can spread positive behavior across social networks. Psychologists were incorporating the story into their work on empathy and connection. Sociologists were using it as an example of how individual actions can challenge and improve social norms. The story had also found its way into popular culture. A documentary film was in production about the broader impact of their encounter, following not just Marcus and James, but dozens of people around the world who had been inspired to create their own moments of connection. The film aimed to explore how small acts of genuine humanity can create waves of positive change that extend far beyond their immediate participants. Children's books have been written based on their story, teaching young readers about respect, friendship across differences, and the courage it takes to be authentically human. Educational curricula have been developed around their experience, helping students understand concepts of duty, tradition, cultural exchange, and the power of individual choice to create positive change. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy was the ongoing commitment both Marcus and James had made to living their lives as examples of the values their encounter had represented. They had learned that when people choose to approach one another with genuine respect and openness, the results can exceed anything they might have imagined. Marcus continued teaching with renewed passion, understanding that every interaction with his students was an opportunity to model the kind of authentic human connection that can bridge any divide. His classroom had become a laboratory for empathy, where young people learned not just academic subjects, but also how to see and respond to the humanity in everyone they encountered. James continued his military service with a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve others. He had learned that true honor came not from rigid adherence to rules, but from the wisdom to know when human connection was more important than protocol. His example had influenced other members of the King's Guard, creating a subtle but meaningful shift in how they approached their interactions with the public. A year after their initial encounter, Marcus and James met again at Horse Guards Parade, this time as part of an official ceremony recognizing individuals who had made significant contributions to international understanding and human connection. As they stood together where their story had begun, surrounded by dignitaries, media representatives, and dozens of people whose lives had been touched by their example, they reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple gesture of friendship. The ceremony concluded with Marcus and James recreating their famous high five, but this time it was witnessed by a crowd that understood the full significance of what they were seeing. It was not just a greeting between two friends, but a symbol of hope that in a world often divided by differences, human beings remain capable of recognizing and responding to the best in one another. As the applause died down and the crowds began to disperse, Marcus and James walked together through the same courtyard where they had first met. They talked about their plans for the future, about the ongoing projects and initiatives their story had inspired, and about the responsibility they felt to continue living as examples of the values their encounter had represented. Their story had become larger than either of them, but at its heart, it remained beautifully simple. Two strangers who chose to see the humanity in one another and, in doing so, reminded the world that genuine connection is always possible when we approach each other with respect, openness, and authentic human kindness. The ripples from their 3-second interaction continued to spread, touching lives and inspiring connections in ways they would never fully know. But Marcus and James had learned that the true power of their story lay not in its global reach, but in its simple message that every human encounter is an opportunity to choose connection over division, understanding over judgment, and love over fear. And in a world that desperately needed such reminders, their choice to be authentically human with one another had become a beacon of hope that would continue inspiring others to make similar choices for generations to come.